Okay, we are joined today by Martin Levine, well, why don't you provide us with a little bit of background about yourself? I know you spoke to the Canadian Bar Association immigration lawyers, and a few of them contacted me after saying, you've got to have Martin on. He was a great speaker, a lot of interesting tidbits and knowledge about what's going on in government. So do you want to do just a brief overview of where you served and when?
Sure. Just as a tiny correction, it's Levine.
Levine,
Everybody
okay.
mispronounces it. Okay, well, I served in the Canadian Foreign Service as a visa officer from 1978 until 2009. During my career, I did a combination of being posted
Yeah.
at several different missions overseas, and I did a lot of temporary duty, which, as far as I know, is still very much required. Temporary duty is when a visa office is short on officers temporarily, so they asked for headquarters to send somebody out to fill in until, I guess, the next posting season. That's
Gotcha.
how
Did
it
you
works.
did you spend big stretches at specific visa offices? And if so, which ones?
Well, when you're posted, you spend a stretch of 2 to 4 years, depending upon the hardship level of the post. I was posted at New Delhi, at London, at Vienna, and at Manila. So
Those are
are
some
four
interesting
rather
posts.
different posts.
Yeah, I would say.
Good tour.
And I did temporary duty in all sorts of places, London as well, Paris, Bucharest, Bonn, Damascus, Tel Aviv, Singapore, Moscow, and a few, Islamabad in Pakistan, and a few others.
So when we previously interviewed Corey Clamp, a few people after were saying that one of the parts that they found interesting about that interview was learning how he got into the role. And I mean, the recruitment process is probably different now than it was in 1978. But like back then, like how does one get into that role if someone does want to be a globe-trotting visa officer?
Well, again, I haven't done a study on what is done now, but when I was recruited, it was a direct process and all done, of course, by paper and by mail. The Foreign Service would advertise entry to a Foreign Service position. They'd parcel you out to whatever part of the Foreign Service you seem most appropriate for. They gave you an interview. Mine was in Ottawa, as I recall. Well, it didn't have online interviews way back then. I passed, and then I went for training, and then I started my first posting in New Delhi.
And after being a visa officer, you became, is it ATIP, the right acronym? You became an ATIP officer?
After I retired, I did a sort of secondary post-retirement career doing ATIP for about 7 years.
And which departments was that with?
Oh, several, because it's done in Ottawa. Again, often ATIP departments run short of permanent staff, and they bring in contract workers through various agencies here in Ottawa. I've been to all sorts of places. My last one was probably my best at the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, but I've also been at Natural Resources, at DND, at Service Canada, at the Department of Justice, and a few others.
So is that common that the ATIP officers will, I guess, retain their profession as being an ATIP officer and go department to department?
Sure. Again, I did it as a post-retirement career, but there are some people, like the objective is normally to become, as we say in the federal government, indeterminate, a
Yeah.
permanent member of staff with all the benefits that accrue from that. But there's a lot of people that I met who were not retirees who are doing contract work as a career.
Contract work throughout their career.
Yeah, that's not so uncommon. I mean, they
Yeah.
would strive to get a permanent position, but here in Ottawa, positions are always tight. The Treasury Board rides all the departments, and it's not so easy to get a indeterminate position for anything nowadays.
Yeah, I think that's something that is not that well known outside of the public service is how hard it is to get a permanent role. Were most like so most ATIP officers, at least at like say IRCC or CBSA, would they have been career ATIP officers, or are there a lot of people like yourself who went visa officer to ATIP officer?
Depending on what department you're in, because I was in a number of them. In some departments, you find a majority of indeterminate officers, but some were relying very heavily on contract workers. Like when I was at Natural Resources Canada, they were heavily reliant on bringing in contract workers, and the number of indeterminate workers they had was nowhere near sufficient to meet the heavy demand, the many applications for information that they received.
And is the reason for the high level of contract workers because scaling up and scaling down of different departments is so politically motivated that
Well,
resource
it's also
shifting?
it's a lot of this is built. A lot of things in Ottawa are built around the uh, power of the Treasury Board. Uh, the Treasury Board, once you hire somebody indeterminately in the federal government of Canada, it's very, very difficult to get rid of them. You'd have to have gross malfeasance uh, or somebody behaving very inappropriate, like open sexual harassment or that type of thing, or repeated incidents of open racism to get rid of them. So you've taken on this person, and as long as they perform at least adequately, you cannot fire them unless you go through an exercise of eliminating positions, which is very, very difficult. And most departments just don't want to go there. So
But
that's
how
core
does
reason.
this, I don't want, I didn't
No
mean to cut you
problem.
off.
No, that's okay.
Um,
Please proceed.
well, I'm curious, like, how does this culture of contract work, how does that impact on like institutional knowledge? You know, when you have this kind of, I
Uh,
mean, in the private sector, turnover is the death of productivity. So I'm wondering why that isn't also the
at the
case in the
risk of
public.
sounding very cynical, but this is a combination of my observations as a visa officer and as an ATIP officer. Productivity is simply not the main goal. The main goal is to obey the provisions set forth by Treasury Board. Uh, so yes, in the experience that I had, like certainly at Natural Resources and several other of the departments where I worked as an ATIP officer, corporate memory was badly lost. Like expertise was seriously lost because of the heavy reliance on contract workers. Even if you're highly competent, it is just not that easy to step into the shoes of the last officer, if there was the last officer, doing the work that you've been given and do it the same way. ATIP, somebody described it to me as not a science, but an art. So no ATIP officer is going to have exactly the same approach as another one. So yeah, you have a lot of loss.
Is that the same at IRCC as well, where it seems like, and I've seen through a lot of ATIPs that I've obtained as well, where people, it seems, are always constantly being shuffled. I know the union has complained that, you know, recently especially, there's a priority this month, a priority that month,
Mhm.
with then people again getting shuffled. And when you factor in like contract work, as well as the huge growth in the number of people at the department,
Yes.
it just seems like it would be an institutional nightmare, institutional memory nightmare.
I'd have to agree with you.
Was that the case when you'd started, or has the reliance on contract labor been a
No, it
trend that
wasn't the case.
evolved over the decades?
No, it was not like that when I started way back in 78. Uh, Generally, the issue has been keeping the size of the permanent, indeterminate public service down. Because in my time, we've gone through several budgetary crises in Canada, and public patients were well-paid public servants, particularly in Ottawa, where the work we do is not always understood by the public. It's not seen as relevant to their lives. There's no patience with having more indeterminate public service with all these benefits and secure pay and that type of thing. So over time, as budgets got ever tighter and the Treasury Board ever more militant, more and more the departments had to turn to contract workers because they were heavily restricted from hiring indeterminate workers. And another thing is that they never have been very good in dealing with, and maybe nobody could be, is that many departments experience peaks and troughs of work. And certainly it's a case in ATIP, and particularly in smaller shops and smaller departments. You could go through a period where like even one requester could give you dozens of requests, either because they're sincerely interested or frequently because they want to harass the department because they're mad about something. But then you can have a trough where there's no work at all. So how do you justify having several indeterminate ATIP contractors when they're just drinking coffee and chatting? And
Did
they,
IRCC ever scream, we need people from other departments? Because it seems like they've had an explosion in the number of ATIPs.
I've never heard, well, again, this is maybe something I would never work for them, so I don't know what their inner culture is like, but you can't just transfer workers from one department to another. When you're hired as an indeterminate worker, you're hired by a department. If you wish, you yourself could apply for lateral transfer, but more commonly that happens when you're really getting very bored with what you're doing, or maybe, for example, your partner, your spouse, receives a good job offer in another city, and you're hoping to make a lateral transfer to another indeterminate government job in that city. But for example, the IRCC cannot say to other departments here in Ottawa, okay, we're really short, so you've got to send us some indeterminate positions. That's not how it works. Departments do not give up indeterminate positions, no matter how dearly in need another department is.
But the irony here that because of public pressure at not wanting to have indeterminate positions, we instead have contract positions, massive loss of institutional knowledge, processing inefficiencies and all of that sort of thing. And you're saying this in terms of the contract work at the ATIP offices, but I understand from what you said to Steve that this also in some ways is reflected in the visa office work as well because of the term nature of those contracts. Is that right?
Well, okay, it's something I should have said to begin with. Unlike other components of the federal public service, visa officers are not hired to a specific position. They're hired to a level. Now, in my day, they didn't have the trainee level, they have it now. But when you're trainee, you are not attached to a specific, every position has a number.
Are you talking about like PM1, CR2, EC5, like all the job classifications?
If you're PM2, normally there would be a specific position number in a specific federal department or agency that's yours. That's it. The way the contracts work would be very difficult, unless again the person is grossly malfeasant, to get them out of that position. So that's how it's done. You can't transfer people like that. It's just not provided for. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that a lot of what people outside of the Ottawa bubble, if I could put it that way, will imagine that there's clever plots and all sorts of strange things going on and conspiracies and failure to release information, just don't understand the daily mechanics of the government. Indeterminate workers have strict contracts. Contract workers have strict contracts. They cannot be violated. They're contractual agreements. You can't do stuff outside of that framework of contracts and the various pieces of federal legislation around the management of public servants. It's not possible.
In terms of those strict rules, like how did you find that that applied in the visa officer context? So like one thing that I think a lot of lawyers or applicants will wonder is the level of discretion that individual visa officers have to make a decision without supervisors kind of looking over them, or informal quota targets if those exist on the number of approvals. I don't know if that's something you can speak to, or
Oh yeah, I can speak to
yeah.
that because I've been there, done that. Um, uh, in my experience, there was a perpetual battle between the line visa officers and the supervisors. There's an inherent problem in the visa section, if I could put it that way, of the Foreign Service. Some years ago, court rulings established that he or she who hears must decide. So you're the line officer, the applicant presents their case, if I could put it that way, to you. You have to make the decision. You cannot transfer by law responsibility for that position to a supervisor. There's only a few cases like making a determination of refugee status where the law requires that the line officer, the officer who hears, make a report to a supervisor and the supervisor then decides. However, I commented on this in other fora. Um, it was explained to me when I was a visa officer that the visa section of the Foreign Service had an authoritarian culture. And that was presented to me as if there was some justification for that. So the officers had a tradition of riding the supervisors, I should say, had a tradition of riding the line officers very, very hard.
In terms
Uh,
of
in terms of virtually everything,
okay.
evaluating the quality of your work, evaluating your attitude, evaluating the way you interacted with other staff, the degree of respect shown to managers, which is expected to be very high. So here you have this conundrum. You're doing a job in good faith and to the extent of your knowledge. Somebody presents a case to you, an applicant or their representative presents a case to you. You make your decision as you have to, as you're legally required to do on your own, but your supervisor does not agree with it. I've had situations like that in several cases. Recall one situation when I was on temporary duty in Seattle. I made a decision about some case. In that case, they had a inland manager from immigration in Vancouver temporarily supervising the visa office. We had a prolonged discussion where she presented this to me and that to me. I was trying to be as courteous as I could and said, I considered this, I considered that, I noted it up, but in good conscience, I can't see unless further evidence is produced how I can change my decision. I saw the disappointment on her face. She's visibly very displeased, and that was disturbing because visa officers rely on annual appraisals to advance. But in good conscience, there was nothing I could do about it. I would have liked to say, oh, I'd said to the supervisor, oh, you've told me something I didn't understand before, or you brought to my attention a piece of the legislation that I did not sufficiently comprehend. And you need to be aware that you can make mistakes and a supervisor can correct that. There's nothing I could do.
Yeah.
Some officers, frankly, will bend the rules because they desperately want a good appraisal because they want to advance.
Would a good appraisal, and maybe it's visa office specific, but um, did that pressure come from more approvals or refusals?
Dependent upon I don't want to use the term whim, that's
Yeah.
a little bit extreme. It depended upon the views of the manager, the senior manager would write your appraisal. In some cases, some of them were strict in their inclination and wanted to see you refusing generously, refusing a lot. Some of them, maybe more of them, because of the irritation and time involved in answering representations, pressured very hard for visa officers to make positive decisions. So
Yeah.
they're influenced by, say somebody writes to their member of parliament, the member of parliament gets on the email, or usually a staffer in their constituency office, and the discussion goes back and forth with the member of parliament getting ever more frustrated and then making representations to a member of cabinet or something. It can become very, very difficult. So the manager wants to avoid that. But what are you supposed to do when you've made your decision in good conscience?
So
Mhm.
essentially, there can be a culture within a specific visa
Oh,
office where
yes.
there's an effort to influence to whatever is the objective of that supervisor.
Yeah, you'll never catch anybody noting up that, in my opinion, this application should be decided this way, but because of the concerns expressed by my manager, uh, I will defer to their opinion. You can't write that up because it's illegal.
Yeah.
And no, and if you put that on the record and management or headquarters in Ottawa sees that, forget about your career, basically.
Yeah. I mean, that's something we've talked about on the podcast before is the amount of unwritten unwritten factors in a decision that will never make it onto
Mhm.
the record. I was recently talking with a tribunal member, and I'm going to be deliberately vague because I know they won't want it repeated. And what they were saying is that it is easier to approve applications than it is to refuse them, even if
Oh,
you
yeah.
think refusal is merited, because it's much less likely to be challenged or scrutinized. Is that,
Yeah.
and so they feel a pressure almost just from ease of job to approve. Did you feel that was the same as well?
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
And again, I want to make it clear. I consider being a visa officer as a privileged job. I'm not in any way complaining. It was probably a much more interesting and fulfilling job than much of what the Canadian labor force does. But you're working like a dog in a lot of these offices. Uh, if you just sort of blink and look the other way and say, okay, I'm going to pass this, uh, you're saving yourself having to answer to representations and a sometimes angry and frustrated manager. So, on top of keeping your principles, it's a question of not having a large part of your working day uh, wasted by answering representations or by having a not very happy dialogue with your supervisor. So, of course, the easy way out is to just approve whatever. The only thing is, if we're talking about independent applicants, skilled workers in particular, uh, say you do your point assessment. I mean, nowadays a lot of us not done an interview anymore. That's getting old fashioned. But wherever you're doing it, you're doing your unit assessment as you have to do, and the person simply fails. Now, if in your opinion the unit assessment does not accurately reflect the ability of the applicant to establish and make a contribution to Canada, you could, this is one situation where you could request a ruling by a senior officer, but court judgments have established that you can only do that for economic reasons. And when you feel that the unit score is not a correct assessment of that person's ability to succeed in the Canadian economy. So what are you going to do? I mean, you have somebody who might be sympathetic and you know that the manager wants that person passed, and you just can't. You're doing your unit score. Okay, put a few more units here or there. No. And if you do anything else, you're outright lying.
Mhm.
So you're in a
That's
box.
become tighter and tighter over time. I don't think a substituted evaluation even exists anymore.
I
Not in
haven't.
reality, but
I think it still exists in the legislation. I stand to be corrected, but
Yeah, it's
no.
in the regs, but the way the point system works is well, because the tests are also like on language, the tests are so much more
Of
standardized.
course, yes.
Um, I think you see it still a bit with provincial nominees from certain provinces, but the express entry ranking system, in theory, is inviting the cream of the crop.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's
yeah,
marked on the curve.
yeah,
yeah, it's
basically.
pretty
So
tight.
if you've already gotten in, it's like almost a positive substituted. It's hard to rig, well, I mean, I can think of a few economists who would disagree, but it's hard to rig the express entry system in terms of whether someone will be able to immigrate or economically establish themselves
Mm-hmm.
in Canada.
I'm still really stuck on this notion of institutional knowledge. I think that there's a lot here, just in terms of, like you've talked about the different rankings of roles and the recognition that somebody who's been doing this for longer and has more seniority, has more experience, has more understanding, is there recognition for those advanced skills in the visa office environment?
It depends on the views of the manager. I mean, you could have, as I've had, friendly, humane, reasonable, fair managers who will come to your office and say, I am really impressed with your work. Keep it up. If you do, you can count on me giving you a very favorable performance appraisal where I will say that you are ready for promotion. But it depends entirely on the attitude of the visa officer. One thing that's really important to understand, certainly for the immigration bar to understand, a lot of the people at a visa office are not Canadian visa officers, and certainly not indeterminate Canadian visa officers. Much of the work is done by locally engaged staff and locally engaged officers. Some of them very good, some of them not so good. And also, there's a lot of use of single assignment officers. Typically, you take somebody from the domestic side of immigration or even farther afield, and for one experience in their career, they go and work in a visa office. One posting, one time, that's it. Or, as I was saying earlier, there's heavy use of temporary duty. So okay, you're sitting there in Ottawa doing your desk job because you're not allowed to remain overseas all the time. That would be terribly expensive. It's very expensive to maintain visa officers and their dependents overseas. So you turned to Ottawa from some other posting overseas a few years ago. You're now integrated in the Ottawa headquarters environment, doing headquarters type work. And then personnel contacts you and says, New Delhi or Manila or Beijing are really, really seriously short on officers. Would you mind going for a few months to do some temporary duty? Well, yes, you're an experienced officer a lot of the time, but you're not experienced with the working environment of Beijing unless you've previously been posted there. So you go in with good judgment, a lot of good skills, but in terms, if you talk about the corporate memory, you have no memory at all what goes down at Beijing. You got to learn it from the day you get there. Some offices will give you a few days and they'll have somebody sit down with you, say, look at this document, it can be frauded, or in terms of Canadian educational achievements, it means this. But some don't have the time or the personnel or the inclination to do that. So your first day, they pick you up and take you to the visa from your hotel and take you to the visa office. You start.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare. I mean, just from running a small law office myself, the idea of even somebody who's been a very experienced paralegal or lawyer somewhere else, bringing them into a different environment and being like, just go. The challenges there seem almost insurmountable.
Oh, yeah. Well, we see the results. I could put it that way. The Canadian selection system is about numbers, not about quality. Now, of course, the annual immigration announcement to Parliament is binding. The minister responsible for immigration has to make it in late October, early November. That's a promise to Parliament. So achieving that level, achieving those numbers, trumps everything else. So you
I
don't
think you
have
can notice that towards the end of the year where all of a sudden there'll be this rush of decisions in
uh,
some categories and you start thinking, oh, there's a quota that they're trying to reach.
you're not meant to use a Q word, but it's a quota. The reason I say it's not a quota because it's not a precise number, it's a range.
Yeah.
So that's more important than the working culture of the office, fairness to managers, fairness to visa officers, fairness to the applicants, or fairness to anybody else.
What are your thoughts like that? I think starting this year for the first time, they're going to add temporary residency targets to the report to Parliament on immigration. in terms of like, based on your experience at the department, how feasible or sound a policy is that?
It's long overdue. Now, in terms of what statistics I can access as a retiree, the problem has nearly exploded over the past few years. And some of that, a lot of it, isn't so much from temporary workers on work permits who are hired for a specific job in Canada, or even students from Australia, New Zealand, or elsewhere who are coming to Canada with an open work permit under an exchange program. It's specifically the growth in the number of international students in Canada. Now, in another forum, I made the point that the expectation in the old days when I started, an international or foreign student, as we called them then, is there to be in Canada for a few years, hopefully pick up a degree and go home. But that principle has been undermined by both the federal and the provincial governments using international students as an immigration stream. So now you're holding at any given time, as I understand it now, a very large number of so-called students and some temporary workers, because some provinces offer that opportunity of a quick access to permanent residence. They're essentially an immigrant population that has not been recognized. I mean, they got to live somewhere. They can't live in a student dorm all the time. And that was not being reported to Parliament. And that was wrong, in my opinion. Now, at least, if you add in these temporary residents, any member of Parliament who has sufficient interest or expertise in immigration and demographic affairs could say, whoa, you're saying there's all these people on temporary status in Guelph, Ontario, and it's grown by exponentially over the past 5 years. Just where are those people living?
I just remember when, I can't remember when it was exactly. I think it was back in the days when I was still very much involved with the Canadian Bar Association. There was all this talk about we need to be careful not to create a temporary resident underclass. And then we proceeded to create a temporary resident underclass. Like
that's exactly what they did.
They were even talking about use Australia, use Europe as a cautionary tale. And then like, oh, surprise, look, this happened.
Well,
I just, there's a hilarity about it.
I was posted in Vienna, and something like a fifth of Austria's total population are so-called Gastarbeiter, guest workers. They're not guests at all. They're not guests. They'll be in Vienna or Salzburg or Linz until the day they die. And we just went and copied that.
Yeah, and when people come here and they're spending tens of thousands of dollars on education and subsidizing the cost of domestic students, like the idea that then they're going to just pick up and go home, like I don't understand the rationale there.
Well, I understand part of the rationale. Canada has a basic labor market problem. Our labor force is declining and aging. Now, in other fora that I've participated in, you get fairly emotive people say these jobs should go to Canadians. Well, what Canadians can you find to fulfill the job? So mom and dad are in the old folks home back in Winnipeg. I go there, and when I went there, when they hadn't yet passed on, much of the staff were Filipinos, many of them on work permits. Was I going to say, well, why are these non-Canadians here in our Manitoba doing jobs that Manitobans should get? There's no Manitobans who are going to take that work.
Yeah.
And nobody's going to migrate to Winnipeg from British Columbia to take up a job in January in Winnipeg.
I mean, they're considering amending the Federal Courts Act to like remove the requirement that judges have to live in Ottawa because Canadians are so reluctant to move for work.
Well, yeah. We're not America here. Canadians are not so fond of going and venturing in another part of Canada. But the other thing I wanted to point to is that a good reason why no sane policymaker in Ottawa will want to point the finger at the growth in international students is because the province and the educational institutions were relying on it. So you do not want to initiate a memo or go to your supervisor at your desk in downtown Ottawa and say, well, I think this is an issue of concern and I'd like to write about it. No, you're not going to get permission to do that, or you were not
Well,
allowed
the
to
speed, I'm
exploit it.
sure also, like, I mean, a lot of people fault the current government for how did they not react to the increase in students. And when you look at the chart, it was so sudden and drastic that the pace with which things move in Ottawa, I'm sure just almost couldn't keep up with it.
I know it's so commonly said, but Ottawa does not move quickly. So as I understand, again, I stand to be corrected because I'm no expert in provincial or college finance. Ontario, which again, I'm not an Ontario, proud person. I'm a Manitoban, but Ontario did not support its post-secondary public institutions the way that some other provinces have. And of course, costs of doing business have been going up for everybody everywhere in Canada. So here's these institutions that have essentially their funding from the government of Ontario frozen. Where are they going to get the money to operate? Purely and simply. And as the funding situation created a near crisis, what choice did they have? This was open to them to recruit more international students, and some of them were actively recruiting and still are, and then to hire private colleges to contract out to them some of the work without really supervising, in many cases, how legitimate the private colleges were. So over like 5 years is nothing in the terms of the government of Canada. It's everything in terms of a college like that in someplace in Ontario that doesn't want to go bankrupt the way a university recently did. So it's the needs of the college administrators and teachers, immediate needs not to get fired, versus somebody in Ottawa who has other memoranda to write.
No, this is brilliant. I mean, I think that this makes perfect sense. It was all quite foreseeable in the sense that a need exists. There was no limitation. There was an opportunity. The opportunity was utilized. And now, the department is claiming foul and now trying to pivot and reverse back. I'm not sure about the rationale, but I also, again, I know I'm like a one-trick pony right now. I'm sort of, I'm still stuck on the trying to actually come up with a reasonable, what are we going to like the institutional knowledge just seems to me so important. And I feel like, the system does not, like the way that the system is structured, I understand it's different and it is the way that it is for a variety of reasons, but this is what I am concerned about. And this is what I feel like we keep seeing in the way that policy is developed. It's like, it makes sense for a specific issue and this specific moment of time, but it's not put into the broader context.
The problem there is not so much institutional memory, it's jurisdictions and the limited number of minutes in a day for I've done this type of work for policy analysts who are working at desk jobs or working from home, more recently in Ottawa and elsewhere, or no, principally in Ottawa. Your job is not to start looking at things in your provincial jurisdiction. And of course, under the Constitution, education, certainly post-secondary education, is a provincial matter. Your feeling is you shouldn't even be involving yourself with those issues, nor do you have any particular information about the situation in the province of Ontario or Quebec or British Columbia than any other average citizen would. So you're told to do your job. You do your job. You don't spontaneously say, well, I was reading this in the Toronto Star about students taking up housing and shouldn't we do something? That will not be popular. You work in a silo. That's how it's meant to be. You're meant to work in a silo. You're answerable to your manager. Any memoranda are the meat of what you do at a desk job in Ottawa. You don't write your own memoranda and send it to the associate deputy minister. It has to pass scrutiny at multiple levels. Typically, many drafts will be required, and they won't tolerate that. You address federal issues. You don't try to address provincial issues or municipal issues. It's not your business.
So on the topic of institutional knowledge and looking at some of the questions we got on social media, a lot of the questions can kind of be funneled into, can artificial intelligence or advanced analytics or automation serve as that institutional knowledge where you don't need people as long if you're able to create machines that will essentially make the same decisions as people historically did?
Well, here's the thing, AI is advancing faster maybe than we anticipated. I mean, 5 years ago, who anticipated that Chat GPT is showing signs of sentience? And this is something I've been reading about this week. Why bother having human officers at all? Uh, as a visa officer, I admit I made many mistakes about visa applications, and any visa officer who does not admit that is not being frank with you. Why don't you just, if you can get to a level of Chat GPT or a similar type of application sounding as if it's sentient in a science fiction movie, just let them do it because they don't forget. You could have corporate memory, but you could forget it. AI will not forget anything that it's learned about how things ought to be done. AI is not subject to subjective biases, and being a human means being subjective. AI isn't going to worry that a senior manager is going to be irritated with it. Let AI do it. I think we're getting pretty close.
So I mean, we've had people on the podcast and we'll have people on the podcast who I know will take the opposite approach, although I happen to agree. And part of where that comes from, or at least my perspective on AI playing a huge role, relates to a second set of questions that we got, which is the dicey topic of, given the sheer volume that visa officers are expected to read and the number of decisions that they are expected to produce in very, very short times, is it even possible for officers to read the entirety of applications that they are receiving, which in theory, ChatGPT could just scan the whole application in a matter of seconds?
Good point. Well, it depends where you work. Like particularly smaller offices, smaller visa offices can go through flat periods. In fact, even bigger ones can sometimes get a little bit flat. Now, particularly a particular example is when an office is running up on a visa office is running up on its level, its quota for the year, because what immigration does is to parcel out the general level for every class of immigrant and dole out quotas, if you like, to the different visa offices. Say by September of a given calendar year, you run out. You've run up your quota. You've been processing a little bit too fast. The manager of the office will already have received communications from Ottawa expressing concern. So towards the end of the year, you may have a thumb twiddle time. And you may have all kinds of time to read a given application, but it just depends. At some offices that are like super duper factory offices, that won't happen. And I agree with the concept that AI may be able to do a much better job than an exhausted visa officer, locally engaged staffer, in receiving the fullness of an application, paying attention to everything that's been presented.
To what extent, like one of the counters I've heard is that, yes, the final officer may not be reading the whole application, but there is someone along the stage who is, whether it's the locally engaged staff who
No,
produces the pre-assessment notes.
no,
No?
no. Managers wouldn't typically have a time unless the office is going through a very flat period. Managers have obviously a lot to do. And see, local engaged staff, a lot of them are clerical level. So you can't expect them to understand every relevant component of an application. It's impossible. You have to pay them like 3-4 times as much. And while local engaged officers are often highly competent, they got their own work to do. They can't be supervising, like reevaluating your work and pointing out things to you. That's not their role in the office.
So what role do the pre-assessment notes play in the decision-making process?
Depends on the quality of your locally engaged staff. Some of them, if you're talking about corporate memory and experience, some of them are very good. And they, in their pre-assessment notes, they may point out things that are really important for the visa officer to pay attention to. So rather than the visa officer having to scan the whole application in the limited time that they have, they may be able to focus down on a point that's been brought forward that's very significant to whether the applicant will pass or not. But again, I don't know what the situation is like now and what training they get, but a lot of them just weren't that good.
Yeah.
I have to say, I mean, in terms of the role of AI, I do understand. So I do understand the speed. I understand the apprehension of bias issue. At the same time, I do need to to be the voice of opposition, because I think, you know, the lack of transparency in the algorithm is the part that gives me concern, especially when you're talking about decisions around things like overstay risk. Like, it may be statistically true that nationals from a certain country, for example, might have a statistically higher chance of overstaying, but the fact that that is going to lead to a higher rate of refusal, like, it ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, you know, it ends up kind of in, you know, in the end of the day, you know, even though somebody might have this country of citizenship, they might not have any personal or very low risk of being an overstay. And I do think that there are statistics, there's algorithms, but there's also human anomalies that I think that I would rather that a human would identify that.
Well,
And one other thing about this, which is that I feel like what I worry about is again, it's all about transparency and accountability, is that I think that I worry that artificial intelligence will become, well, and I think it already has, it becomes very savvy about what is going to JR proof a decision. So that, you know, what we talked about is we're not getting the real reasons in the GCMS notes. So if I say that, well, this person is from this place and therefore I think that they're never going to go back because of da da da, if they know that that would be overturned, they will just offer an answer that is going to be more likely to withstand judicial scrutiny. It kind of makes a mockery of the entire judicial intervention if it's based on a bias or based on a discriminatory or an unconstitutional principle. How do we, like, again, it's and this is something that I think we're going to talk about in an upcoming podcast about entrenching views that are buried into an algorithm that you need to be an engineer or a sophisticated scientist to unpack. I don't like that.
Well, you're talking, I think, in particular about visitor visa situations. If you're a human visa officer doing a day of work at a visa office, you're expected to pump them out. You maybe have 5, 6, 7 minutes per application. You are only going to be able to focus on a few points. Their previous travel record, their economic level, whether they are so well fixed where they normally live that they have no incentive to sneak into Canada and stay there illegally. That's all it is. That's all it is. So you cannot consider the fullness of the applicant. And for the most part, you don't see them. You don't even see the applicant because the days of the interview are fading into the past. So there isn't all this intellectual activity or corporate memory or reference to law.
I agree with that, but I think then I rely on the flaws in the decision in order to be able to get it overturned when it's a truly meritorious case.
How do you have a flaw in a visa officer decision? This is a situation where it's left to the officer or locally engaged officer or maybe to AI to make a decision, and there isn't any detailed, like, carved into law standards about what ought to be considered. That's a legal gap.
Sort of. But when, like, if we're saying that when you send an application in, and in this case, I have hundreds of pages of evidence, and it's going to get 3 minutes of attention, and then it's going to get refused. The flaw is that the system doesn't allow for the nuance or the volume of evidence or and so it can't. And so that's the flaw. And so it might not be
But
written
is the
into the
solution to that
legislation.
flaw going to be to blow out budgets so that officers have more
Yeah.
time? Or if you can
That will
get
not.
like ChatGPT type stuff that is approximating what humans do and will be able to address every point in the decision and will be able to do almost a sentence by sentence rebuttal.
Yeah, but I feel that what it's going to do is it's going to get better than like it's going to be able to provide a rationalization that is going to make it hard or impossible for me to do it by judicial review. Not because it's the
Oh, I
right
agree it'll make
decision,
judicial review harder.
Yeah.
but it
But I'm
doesn't
not sure
necessarily
if
mean that
that
it's not reaching the right decision in my view, like the fact that it
uh,
knows all of the case law. I
right,
don't
but
know.
like
It
would
did
it
do
do
a
better than a
reasonable.
human? I mean, going back to like the amount of time spent on an application, whenever I bike in, I can see the people lining up for at the American consulate for their interviews. Do you think everyone should be interviewed?
In my opinion, it's pointless. Again, I'm speaking from my long experience in seeing encounters between the Treasury Board and whatever department of the federal government at the time that was dealing with immigration. Those types of resources are not going to flow to processing visas. They certainly will not flow to processing visitor visas. You just don't have the resources for that. Treasury Board will never approve it. So either you accept, and again, as I said, the legislation does not compel any points of judgment when you're considering a visa application. It's do you believe them or do you not believe them? Purely and simply. And the federal court gets irritated when you don't do any notes at all. So you do maybe a paragraph, or frequently you cut and paste it because you haven't got the time to do the paragraph. Has not satisfied me that they will leave Canada at the end of their permitted stay, and you could do blah, 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 not well established in their home country, blah, 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 young single individual with no family commitments in home country, blah, 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 was forced to leave another country. So you plop a few in, and you've done your job, your supervisor's happy enough with the way you've done it, and then you move on.
Yeah. Here's another a good question, and it brings up something that we've talked about on the podcast, which is how much were you on the lookout for misrepresentations?
Always.
Always. So like what would determine in your mind if something got to that threshold of warranting a formal procedural fairness letter or misrepresentation finding?
Well, I'm not sure how many procedural fairness letters are issued for simple visitor visa applications, but we were encouraged to identify situations where procedural fairness was required and to issue a letter expressing our concerns. So you have told me that you have sufficient funds to pay for your coming year of study in Canada, but all you have given me is your letter from an uncle who's living in the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain, and you have not shown me how that uncle can be required to make the payments to you. Nevertheless, we're giving you an opportunity to show us that you have some other source of accessible funds that is in your name in a bank account, that will prove to us that you do indeed have sufficient resources to pursue your coming year in Canada. So yeah, that was made clear to us even at the time, and very frequently were procedural fairness letters issued. Of course, you can't craft one for every application, so of course formats were designed and standard letters were designed, and away you go.
Yeah. Do you think like one thing that I've argued is that I have issues with a 5-year bar for all misrepresentations, and that I've argued that visa officers should have the discretion that if they make a misrepresentation finding, that individual officers should be able to decide between a 0-year bar, a 1-year bar, a two. Like they should be able to decide
Oh,
the length of
yeah.
the, oh, big head shaking. Okay, so why Why do you think that's a bad idea?
Well, I would say this about a line visa officer. You just work there. As Elvis said, you just work there. Your level of judgment is not considered high enough to make a decision like that. It's offensive to your manager for an underling to be allowed to do that. At best, managers might be allowed to structure being barred from Canada like that. What the common law justification for allowing a bureaucrat to do that is, I don't know. It's just not going to happen. That's a decision that has to be made automatic based on what was done. So you can say either they made a material misrepresentation. We've considered whether it might have been an innocent mistake. We do not believe it's an innocent mistake. I was going to mention humanitarian grounds, but you can't consider humanitarian grounds in most applications. That's for refugee and similar situations. So you can't really say this person made a lie, but I can see they're very stressed. I feel sorry for them. So in this case, let's overlook it and give them a chance to show that they're good. You can't do any of that. So you can't do that type of thing in a visa office.
But so I'm like, it would, I mean, I would think that a humanitarian and compassionate application would be more complicated to reach that decision than a 1-year bar versus a 3-year bar. Like, what's the,
The things you don't have humanitarian compassionate for visitor situations,
mm,
unless maybe a few situations where somebody's elderly parent is living in India or Romania or whatever. A grandchild is very sick. It's not totally established that this person will have sufficient funds on their own, nor is the family in Canada very well fixed. So you might influence a little bit towards being humane. But that's it, unless the law says that a visa officer will consider humanitarian and compassionate issues with regard to their assessment of a visitor, simple visitor, tourist, or a work permit or international student application. Unless the law says that, you cannot do it.
do you think
Can't,
they should bring it back? They removed it in 2013.
no,
Agency did, no, you think it,
no. How can I put this? Some visa officers were full of love, and some were certainly not full of love. And I don't know how you could train visa officers or any person in any sort of processing environment to be kindly and gentle by nature. You can't do that.
Mm.
You get total inconsistency, inconsistently results. Like I may have a bleeding heart and I may feel terribly sorry for somebody, even if they previously misrepresented and said, I'm giving you a chance. I used to talk to them, you don't. But you could say to them, I'm giving you one chance to show that you're on the level, that you will be compliant with all our legal requirements, and say, I'm going to report to the local authority, local immigration authorities. They're going to watch you. But as long as you watch your step, it's all good. And maybe the next time you apply, we'll just give you the visa without even having to put you through the ringer. You can't do stuff like that.
yeah, that's where we need AI, but because that
That's
could
where you want-
standardize.
That's funny you go that way, because I was like, this is why we can't have AI, because
Oh,
I
that's
think
interesting.
I think it will go toward the zero compassion
I
all
don't
the
think so.
time.
Oh, it'll be however it's programmed.
Well, that's
Um,
exactly
program.
right. It's however it's programmed, and I do not trust that it will go the programming for a compassionate or for a exercise. I mean, discretion is discretion. These are discretionary decisions, always.
Mhm.
And so the exercise of discretion done according to an algorithm, I don't like it. I don't like it.
Well, here's some gratuitous advice to the immigration bar.
Mm,
If you have those concerns, you need to address them precisely where they need to go.
mm.
Writing a letter to a visa officer about how mean they are
Mm.
is pointless. All these representations to a visa office manager, unless they're very pliable, are pointless.
Mm.
If you have real concerns about the almost inevitable transition to processing by AI, the immigration bar has to be aggressive.
For sure. I
I mean,
totally
I
agree with
understand
that.
lawyers have to make a living, and they make a living by doing casework. So I can understand why lawyers would say, I haven't got the time for that type of thing. but is there nobody in the immigration bar who can be longer sighted and more comprehending of the whole system? Some visa officer has no input into what criteria apply to replacing their job by AI.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's ill-directed. But I think, I mean, just to be clear, the idea of using AI in non-discretionary decisions, have at her. I mean, that to me makes absolute perfect sense. Automation where there it's just a, you know, a calculation, da da da, off you go. But discretion is discretion. Discretion is a human thing, and that's where I believe that there's no place for AI.
I can't say that I totally, with respect, I can't say that I totally
Mm-hmm.
agree with you. I'll give you this example, and it's a personal one. So you've been processing your guts out all day. 4 o'clock is approaching. You're dead tired. You do not want to do unpaid overtime at whatever visa offices you're in. And furthermore, you had a bad interaction with your immediate manager, and you're scared. Are you going to exercise detailed discretion, human compassion, human warmth, and human kindness? You're not a rabbi.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, it's even like there's those studies that judges, when it comes to sentencing right before lunch when the judges are
for
hangry,
sure.
it's stricter. I want to shift to some of the ATIP related questions in the time that we have left. And the big one was what, as an ATIP officer, you're disclosing information. It's going to be made available to the public. It could be politically controversial. What is the sort of feedback loop that ATIP officers get in terms of over disclosure, too much redaction?
There isn't
How
much.
there isn't much on an individual file or
No, because a line visa officer does not make the final decision on disclosure. It's different from working as a visa officer. There's no doctrine of he or she who hears must decide in an ATIP office. You do your work, you do your redaction work, then you submit it to your immediate supervisor, who reviews it to see if they feel it's adequately and appropriately done. But the only person who can sign off on the release of that information as it has been redacted is the office manager, or in smaller shops, and some federal shops are very small, some of the agencies, it may be the manager of the entire agency who signs off. So you don't have those issues in that way.
so if someone's saying like, hey, here's a media, obtained through ATIP and it's caused a storm, there's no pressure that comes from the political level or supervisors being, hey guys, let's redact a little more.
Uh, if a politician attempts to exercise interference in an ATIP decision, it's a very serious matter.
Yeah.
And I commonly saw situations where, so you're the ATIP unit. Normally, ATIP units try to keep aloof from the rest of the department or agency, because there is this type of pressure or incomprehension of what an ATIP officer's duties are by law. You can't do that. You can't bow to that type of pressure. You're violating the law.
So when people comment like, oh, there's more redactions now, is that A, do you think that's a myth or just a political talking point? And B, if it's not, where does that sort of come from?
um, I think it's more of a case of people who advocate heavily for more freedom of information are just reluctant to accept the legislation, uh, or don't understand the legislation and don't want to understand it. The legislation gives you opportunities. I wouldn't say opportunities, the duty to redact certain information. You cannot release policy discussions that involve members of a federal or provincial government, depending on whether you're in a federal ATIP shop or provincial ATIP shop. Those are not subject to disclosure. You cannot, cabinet conferences are beyond the scope of the Access to Information and Privacy Acts. So there's no question that you're going to release those. Discussions that are not necessarily about processing some sort of private matter are still affected by the Privacy Act. So say you're doing work under the Access to Information Act, you have to be constantly conscious of third-party privacy. And there's no discussion around that. There's nothing to say if releasing some information would compromise the privacy of a third party. No, You can't do it. So we see a lot of complex cases, and we see a lot of activism, and people are very frustrated with the system, and I understand their frustration. But the law is the law. So again, complaining to an individual ATIP officer saying, you're not doing your job, or you're trying to suppress information, all you're going to do is end up with an irritated ATIP officer, and a manager will not admit to anything at all like that. They've already scrutinized it. They signed off. They're not going to say, oh, yeah, I was too strict. Or maybe I was trying to hide information because the minister phoned me and said, don't you dare. No, that type of thing is not going to happen. So you have ample reasons why you must refuse to disclose information. You know that there is recourse to the Access to Information or Privacy Commissioners if someone is frustrated with it, or if it's a court matter, that release of information can be dealt through by the standards that are applicable to a legal case. That's it. You have nothing more to really concern yourself with. You concern yourself with doing your job right. That's all. And making sure that what you presented is acceptable to your supervisor. And furthermore, that you don't ask your supervisor to sign something that's going to annoy the manager of the office. That's the whole game.
For sure. People are quite angry right now, and their vitriol seems to be
Well, I think people are
bubbling over.
I think people are more accustomed to lashing out and venting because of the social media. So it's become a habit for people to be
Yeah,
extreme.
yeah. True. It's true. It's true. I agree with that.
But does
I
it
think
mean anything? No, it means nothing.
No.
no, and I think just looking at the clock, my last question would be which did you enjoy more, being ATIP officer or visa officer?
I have to say, being an ATIP officer, and I'm not complaining. Again, being a visa officer is a privileged career. I went places and saw things that no Canadian on a regular budget could ever imagine. When the taxpayer is paying for all my excitement and interest in the things I did on the weekend, the quality of work of being a visa officer and the lives of visa officers over my career deteriorated badly.
You know, immigration lawyers say the same thing,
It used to
that
be
it's
when I started that we had visa offices in very desirable places. Like we had in Marseille, we had San Francisco, we had Manchester, we had Athens, we had all these wonderful places to be posted to. The offices were small. If you had an issue, generally a manager's door is open, and you could talk with them. That's gone. Instead, they set up factory offices to process the greatly increased number of applications from the developing world. The status of a line officer in a factory office was ever lower. There's more and more reliance on locally engaged staff or clerical.
How do we do it cheap? How do we do it fast? How do we do it,
That was the whole
volume, widgets? Yeah.
That was the whole thing. And then again, I cannot
And the
stress.
quality is so like the decline in quality is so clear. I mean, that's
Of
my
course it
view
is.
anyways. And I
Of
mean,
course
that's my whole anti AI diatribe. I love technology. I'm not trying to say, but and again, I understand that we'll get a very clear, very fancy, very well written letter from ChatGPT, but I think it devalues the importance of the work done by visa officers, and I
the
think it
work
should
that
be a
was
good
done,
job.
the
That
work
was done.
that
That
was
was
done way
done.
back when you're sitting in Marseille enjoying bouillabaisse for lunch, the manager's door is open, you were upset about something about the way your staff quarters have been furnished by the embassy, the consulate staff or something like that. You go to the manager and say, can we talk behind closed door for a few minutes?
Mm,
And you open your heart to the manager. The manager is not thinking, I'm going to get this person in a performance appraisal. They try
yeah,
to work
yeah,
with you. Gone.
yeah.
Absolutely gone. And then
It's a pretty
laterally,
thankless job, it seems to me now.
it became
And
ever more
oh, right
thankless.
now it seems.
It
yeah,
became ever
yeah.
more thankless. And then we're told that some temporary duty officer who never worked overseas is not even from the immigration department, is just as competent as you are, who may have been given the position, frankly, because they've been given a treat as they approach the end of their domestic career. That was humiliating. For me, it
Yeah.
was humiliating.
They must be
Uh,
cheaper. They might be you know, there might numbers be higher, their approval rates
It's
are more
interesting
in
because it parallel like we've done some episodes with retired immigration lawyers now who also talked about how you see the counterpart happening in the immigration bar where
for sure.
the work, it's always fun for, Deanna and I who are still in the thick of it to be told like it sucks now, but like that it became like much less time per file. Everything becomes R10 focused.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
it's
also, like,
just
this is what I mean. Like, when Dennis was on and he was like, no, like, because when we're working on a case, like, I really believe in that case. I believe in that applicant. And yet you send it off, your 200 pages of carefully crafted evidence and argument, and then you get a stupid one line. Nope, this person's an over. No, they're not. They're
Well,
not. They would never do that. I am convinced. But that loss of that, the human element to me is sad. And so I'm not sure that the idea of the lineup outside of the US embassy is so bad, because we've lost that element of like face to face spidey sense. Do I believe you, or do, because that's what it's really about in the end of the day anyways. We're just pretending it's not.
well,
Or pretending it's not.
I could also put it this way, since I'm a visa officer talking about being one, with regard to the lives of visa officers and their work, a lot of the dignity element has been lost. I return again to this concept of an authoritarian tradition, which was told to me by various managers, even when I was raising serious concerns about human rights. They said, we have an authoritarian culture. I felt like saying, blurting out, tell me where any department or agency has the government of Canada has any right to any culture of any kind at all. There's no right to a culture in a federal government agency or department. There's an obligation to obey all laws pertaining to human resources. Line level staff have to make a commitment to obeying all those laws, to giving managers respect where respect is called for. But don't tell me about any authoritarian culture. I really hope that sort of really silly excuse is gone, but I'm not very confident that it is.
Yeah, no,
no,
it
it's
doesn't
really
sound to me
interesting.
like it. I mean, I know Steve's gonna get mad at me for continuing to talk beyond our 1 hour and 15
No, my
minutes,
point of
but
view, I love to talk.
no, it's I mean, it's sort of, to me, at the very beginning when you started talking about gross incompetence, it bumped big time. And that was the only way for somebody to be taken out of a role, with the foreign
Indeterminate
service.
role.
An indeterminate role. I mean, the part about that the preponderance of roles being temporary and not indeterminate, but also that like gross incompetence, like that to me is disturbing. Like I don't like that idea that like just plain old incompetence, or that's not sufficient to take somebody out of such an important role. Such an important role.
But that's the whole government of Canada, and that is not a culture. That's what's set down in the legislation and all the rules about human resources and calling staff to an account. The bar for somebody being considered grossly incompetent is very, very, very high.
And the fact that that's the standard, that to me is like, isn't that the same thing as cronyism, or as like,
Oh,
I
I mean,
don't
you're
get
trying
it.
to take on the public sector unions.
Yeah, yeah.
Good,
Oh,
good
don't
luck.
do that.
Good luck,
You
Deanna.
can't take on
I've got
the
ambitions.
public sector
Yeah.
units. And if you want to talk about subjectivity and lack of humanity, how can you set an objective standard for incompetence that will cover every department and agency in the federal government?
You don't
Sounds
have to. It's the same as the private sector where
no, it's not. It's not.
Yeah,
I
Not
know,
the
but
same.
why not? I don't get it. I don't
It
get it. I
can't
mean,
be.
I know I'm a public sector, a
we'll
private
have a
sector
PSAC
person.
spokesman on an
Okay.
upcoming episode.
Okay, let's do
No, we
that.
don't actually have one booked, but
In the
Not at
public
all.
service, you don't necessarily promote for ability, you promote for other reasons. And while I totally defend affirmative action and equity actions in the government, sometimes you have two people equally qualified, but one of them is a member of an equity category, they get promoted. So a civil servant should not expect to be dealt with through their career on the strict basis of high standards and competence. There's many other things that come into it. And government departments are not free to just hire and fire people. That's not how any government works. You can't equate it to the private sector. The situation is totally different.
And the
That's where you
reason being
foist.
because you don't want them to be like that subject to
Yeah,
influence, right?
yeah.
It's gone too far, no? Like, anyways,
I don't think
different
so,
episode.
really. I don't think
Okay,
so.
all right.
I would suggest that rather than coming down hard in some way that would probably not withstand any court challenge, uh, try to exercise a bit more compassion. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm whining, but generally compassion towards civil servants is not very high. If you see somebody having a difficulty producing or the quality of their decisions, don't just think, well, I don't want to draw anybody's attention to that because it might make me look like a bad manager who hasn't done what they should do. There should be provision for dealing in a humane way with.
For sure. And burnout is a real thing. Like, and
They don't
again,
want
if
to
there's
recognize
no,
burnout.
okay, well, that's
So,
like,
and if you're in an authoritarian culture, you burn out real quick because you have no agency,
yeah, for
and that's
sure,
classic burnout. And they
for
don't want
sure.
to deal with issues like that.
And
Oh,
that
when
to
I
me,
look at the
again,
schedule, I couldn't do it. I would burn out so quick on the like I had tweeted where there's X many decisions expected per day, which can be met if officers work 6.5 hours per day, read the website 30
Uh,
minutes a day, two bathroom breaks, too, and it's very rigid.
but that's what you were saying, both of you, about in defense of AI. Well, that if it's this, these things influence bad decision making, well, then change those things. Don't get rid of the human. Just make it so that the conditions of work are humane.
I mean, what
Um,
and I don't know the department well enough, like, and I'm certainly it, like the ideal that I'd love to see would be that AI does all these rote things, and then visa officers can be trained to the dignity of doing those H&C or how many year misrep bar there'd be and deal with be trained up to do the complex.
no.
No.
It's all about saving money in the Treasury Board. The Treasury Board decides. They're the supreme agency of the federal government. You can't make an argument like that. The Treasury Board's question always is how does that constrain your budget? How does that reduce the amount of budget allocation we have to give to your department or agency every year? They don't want to hear about quality. They
Yeah, but
don't care.
again, I mean, the budget can't be looking at strictly the efficiency at Visa Office. You have to
Oh,
also
it can.
factor in, oh, I understand that it does, but
It
you
does.
also, in my view, you also have to factor in the untold costs of litigation, needless litigation, like it's out of control right now.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked
But
about which department bears that cost. I don't think
yeah,
IRCC
well, that's
really bears
another
It
that
issue.
doesn't
cost.
matter what bucket it's in. Like, again, this is all mumbo
Oh,
jumbo
it
to me,
matters.
but
If the
it's like,
department,
I get it, but it doesn't make any sense.
well, it does make sense bureaucratically. If you're immigration and you stir up litigation, but the Department of Justice is going to be on the hook for the cost, the hell with the
Somebody
department.
else's
Yeah,
problem.
I mean,
It's
that's
no.
That's
similar
not
to
my
the whole
problem.
like how IRCC doesn't have to reduce processing times at CPCE because the Canada Border Services Agency, a whole other ministry, will be tasked with processing it, and then they'll get annoyed. But from
Uh,
IRCC's perspective, they can allocate funds elsewhere and public
yeah.
They're
safety,
counting on the fact that
PSA.
people are
Yeah,
going
like
to
they're
trot
just
down to the port of
the
entry.
different
Yeah.
there's all the different departments. Yeah.
Silos. That's how it's meant to work.
Yeah.
Silos.
No, it's not meant to work like that. It's how it's working. It's not
No, it
meant to
is.
work like
It
that.
is meant to work like that. We have a budgetary system in the federal government that requires that. Treasury Board is not bad people. They're not trying to persecute anybody, but they have their rules and laws to obey too. And
I'm
they're
in this position of being able to have like absolutely no need to make this system run. I can just say what makes
Deanna's going to run for president of the Treasury Board after this
yeah.
as long
podcast, and
Oh
as
yeah, that
long
was
as
gonna go
they're
well.
as long as they're happy and they can show the cabinet and prime minister the savings they produce, which can be used in a campaign platform. That's all that matters.
did you work through any, like, I know well, I guess you were working through the Deficit Action Reduction Program of 2012, which was the last big budget cuts, I guess, in Ottawa. and a future government may bring it back. Like, how much did that impact your day to day or department's day to day?
Well, I was into contract work by then. It didn't impact contractors much at all because what's going to be cheap and what's going to make Stephen
Mhm.
Harper happier? Hiring a whole bunch of indeterminate workers, some of them on equity grounds, frankly, who cannot be dismissed except for gross misbehavior, or just increasing the number of contractors that can be let go without an explanation. Their contract
Yeah.
can be, their agency's contract can be terminated at any time. Just get rid of them. If they're annoying, get rid of them.
This
I
makes
think
me
Mr.
very
Har-
ranty. Yeah.
I think I know what Prime Minister Harper would have said about that.
Hmm. No, and yeah, like, um, yeah, I mean that it's in like it's well, and it's just this discussion I've been having where people like have brought up, oh, what doesn't it cost IRCC a lot for all the litigation? And I always say, not really. It costs other
Yeah.
departments. So what does IRCC care? Yeah. This has been really fun and fascinating.
I
Yeah,
felt the
super.
same
I
way.
think
I'm
Thank you.
Deanna's
very,
gonna
very
go
glad.
run for politics soon to become president and dictator of the Treasury Board
God
Not just
forbid.
and
dictator. Yeah, yeah.
reform. Exactly. It's skip Treasury Board, just dictator.
I need to, I don't want one line of the Excel spreadsheet. I want the whole spreadsheet.
Uh,
Oh, goodness.
I love being
fun.
retired. I don't want any of it.
Yeah, I get it. I'm getting there fast and furious, I gotta say.
It'll come. The day will come.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank goodness. Okay, thank you so much. It's been a thrill.
It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you.